They said Texas could turn enemies into neighbors, but no one in Washington expected it to turn prisoners into brides. West Texas, September 1944. The heat sat heavy over Camp Hearn like a wool blanket left too long in the sun, pressing dust into the earth and bending the horizon into a trembling line of silver. 30 miles outside the camp, ranchland stretched for miles without fences thick enough to stop the wind, only barbed wire and cedar posts dividing cattle from open country. By then, most of the young men who once worked those ranches were overseas, scattered across Europe and the Pacific, leaving fathers, older brothers, and hired hands trying to keep the land alive. That was how German prisoners ended up in Texas. Not as symbols of war, but as labor. Useful hands where hands were scarce. The arrangement had seemed simple enough when Washington approved it. Prisoners would work. Guards would supervise. Rules would remain rules. But by September, something unusual had started moving through Camp Hearn faster than dust storms. Rumors. Strange ones. Cowboys asking German women to marry them. At first, nobody believed it. Corporal Dean Harper heard it in the mess hall over black coffee and powdered eggs. A ranch hand from Abilene had supposedly asked one of the women from Barrack 7 if she'd stay in Texas after the war. Another had offered a ring made from bent horseshoe iron. Harper laughed when he heard it. Men got lonely. Stories got bigger in the heat. But then a clerk in administration mentioned 3 written complaints from nearby ranch owners. Not complaints about theft. Not complaints about escape attempts. Complaints about their sons falling for enemy women. That was when Major Edwin Collins stopped laughing. Collins had been in charge of labor placement for nearly 14 months. He knew exactly how thin the line was between cooperation and fraternization. And Washington knew it too. Every prisoner assignment had rules written in ink so black they looked permanent. No gifts. No private meetings. No personal attachments. Certainly no marriage proposals. But Texas had its own weather, its own pace, and sometimes its own rules. That morning, a transport truck rolled through the camp gates carrying 6 new German women prisoners transferred from Louisiana. They sat in silence on wooden benches, uniforms faded from months under southern sun, faces pale beneath the dust of the road. Among them was Clara Weiss, 24 years old, from Stuttgart. Before the war, she had studied nursing. During the war, she had worked in military field hospitals, stitching wounds, changing bandages, watching boys barely old enough to shave call for their mothers in the dark. Now she sat with her hands folded in her lap, back straight, eyes forward. Still. Controlled. Quiet. Like she had placed every thought behind a locked door. The truck stopped in the yard. Guards opened the back. One by one the women stepped down into the Texas sun, blinking against the brightness. Clara paused for half a second when her boots hit the dirt. The air smelled different here. Dry leather. Horses. Coffee somewhere nearby. Not war. Not smoke. Something ordinary. Something almost unsettling. Across the yard, leaning against a fence post with his hat pulled low against the sun, Ethan Walker watched them arrive. 31 years old. Born on that ranch land. Raised on horses and hard seasons. His hands were rough from rope burns and fence wire, his face marked by years of sun and wind. He had seen German prisoners before. Men mostly. But these were women. Tired looking. Thin. Silent. One of them caught his eye immediately. Not because she looked afraid. Because she didn't. Clara stepped into line, shoulders straight, eyes fixed ahead like dignity itself had become her uniform. Ethan noticed something then. She wasn't looking at the guards. She was studying the ground. Measuring it. Learning it. Like she planned to survive it. He adjusted the brim of his hat, and stared a moment longer than he meant to. And somewhere beyond the dust, beyond the wire, beyond the rules written in Washington, something had already started moving. Quietly. Like all dangerous things do. The first morning on Walker Ridge Ranch began before sunrise. The air carried that dry September chill that never lasted long in Texas, the kind that disappeared the moment the sun cleared the horizon. Clara Weiss woke to the sound of boots on wooden boards outside the bunkhouse and the distant lowing of cattle somewhere in the dark. For a moment, she did not know where she was. Then the smell reminded her. Dust. Leather. Coffee. America. She sat up on the narrow cot, her blanket folded neatly at her feet, and listened to the quiet breathing of the other women still asleep around her. The room was plain. Wooden walls. Iron hooks. A washbasin by the window. Cleaner than the camps in Louisiana. Cleaner than most places she had slept in the past 2 years. That bothered her more than it should have. Outside, Ethan Walker stood by the barn with a tin cup of coffee warming his hands. He watched the sky turning pale blue over the east pasture, the first light catching on the wire fences like silver thread. His father, Henry Walker, was already saddling horses, moving slower these days, his knees stiff from 50 years on ranch land. Henry looked over at Ethan without lifting his head. You staring at that bunkhouse again? Ethan took a sip of coffee. Just waiting on workers. Henry gave a dry smile. That all? Ethan said nothing. The women came out just after 6. Quiet. Buttoned up. Hair tied back. Their boots kicking dust into the morning air as they lined up outside. Clara stood in front, shoulders straight, hands folded behind her back. Ethan noticed the same thing he had noticed yesterday. No fear in her face. Not pride either. Just discipline. Like she had learned how to survive by making herself smaller on the outside and stronger on the inside. Henry stepped forward with the foreman's list. Work assignments. Fence repairs. Feed hauling. Water trough cleaning. Basic labor. Ethan was supposed to supervise the North Pasture crew. 3 women. Including Clara. They walked out together after sunrise, the ranch opening around them in wide stretches of grass and mesquite trees, the ground dry and cracked from weeks without rain. Clara carried fence tools without complaint, her pace steady despite the heat building fast. Ethan watched her from horseback, expecting hesitation, mistakes, questions. None came. By 8 o'clock, sweat darkened her collar, but her hands moved with precision, twisting wire, setting posts, tying knots like someone who had done hard work before. Not ranch work, but something close enough. Around 10, one of the younger prisoners, Anna Keller, struggled with a feed sack nearly 50 pounds heavier than she could manage. Before Ethan could step in, Clara moved first. She took the weight without a word, shifted it onto her shoulder, and kept walking. Anna looked embarrassed. Clara only nodded once, as if kindness did not require attention. Ethan noticed that too. It stayed with him. Near noon, the sun was high and unforgiving, pressing heat into everything. Ethan called for water break beneath a lone oak near the creek bed. He handed out canteens, one by one. When he reached Clara, their hands brushed for half a second. Her hand was cold despite the heat. He looked at her. You worked in hospitals? Clara looked up, surprised. How do you know? Ethan nodded toward the way she carried the feed sack. You carry weight like somebody used to carrying people. Clara stared at him for a second, then looked away. People are heavier. Ethan almost smiled. It was the first thing she had said to him. Not much. But enough. Around them, the ranch stayed quiet except for the wind moving through dry grass. Somewhere far behind them, beyond the hills and fences and cattle, Washington was still writing rules on paper. But out here, under the Texas sun, paper felt very far away. By the 3rd day, the rhythm of Walker Ridge Ranch had settled into Clara Weiss like dust into cloth. Wake before dawn. Work until sunset. Eat in silence. Sleep hard. Repeat. The days moved by the sun, not the clock. That was new to her. In Germany, time had once been measured by train schedules, hospital rounds, and church bells. During the war, it had been measured by reports, shortages, and waiting. Here in Texas, it was measured by light. Morning light across the fence lines. Noon light burning white over the pasture. Evening light turning everything gold before dark. Clara had started to understand the ranch without speaking much. Where the tools were kept. Which horses kicked when startled. Which gates stuck in dry weather. The place had its own language. Ethan Walker noticed how quickly she learned. He noticed other things too. She never rushed her work, but she never fell behind. She always made sure Anna Keller stayed close in the fields, keeping an eye on the younger woman the way an older sister might. And every morning, before touching breakfast, Clara folded her hands for a few quiet seconds over her plate. Not praying exactly. Just collecting herself. Ethan had seen men do that before battle. Not many after. The other Cowboys noticed the German women too. At first, it had been curiosity. Nothing more. Men like Noah Briggs and Caleb Turner had kept their distance, speaking only when necessary, their voices stiff with caution. Enemy was enemy, even on a ranch. But work had a way of changing people. By the end of the week, Noah stopped calling Anna, the prisoner, and started calling her by name. Caleb showed Greta Hoffman how to patch a saddle strap instead of taking it from her hands. Small things. Quiet things. The kind of changes nobody announced. One afternoon, Ethan and Clara were repairing fence along the south pasture when the sky shifted. Texas weather could turn in 10 minutes. Clear blue to dark gray. The wind came first, dry and sharp, pushing grass flat against the earth. Ethan looked west. Storm coming. Not much rain in it. Mostly dust. They needed to finish before it hit. Clara worked faster, tying wire tight against cedar posts while Ethan hammered staples into the wood. Neither spoke much. But the silence between them had changed. It no longer felt guarded. At one point, Ethan handed her his leather gloves without thinking when the wire cut too rough against her hands. Clara paused, staring at them. "You need these," she said. Ethan shrugged. "I have another pair." It was not true. Clara looked at the gloves for a second, then put them on. They were too large. Worn soft from years of work. Warm from his hands. That stayed with her longer than she expected. By supper, the storm had passed north, leaving only wind and the smell of rain somewhere far away. The workers ate on the back porch that night, plates balanced on their knees, the sun sinking behind the pasture in slow red light. Noah was telling some story about getting thrown off a horse in Amarillo, and for the first time, Clara heard laughter from the women beside her. Real laughter. Not careful. Not forced. Ethan looked over and saw Clara smiling too. Small. Barely there. But real. He realized then that something strange was happening on Walker Ridge. The women were changing the air of the place. Softer somehow. More human. And the Cowboys were changing too. Not because they had been told to. Because they wanted to. Across the porch, Henry Walker watched his son watching Clara. He said nothing. Just sipped his coffee from the same chipped tin cup he had used for 20 years. Some things a father recognized without needing words. Later that night, after the lanterns were out and the ranch had gone still, Ethan sat alone by the barn fence, turning his pocket watch in his hand. His father's watch. Old silver. Heavy. He thought about Clara's hands in his gloves. About the way she worked. About the way she carried herself like the war had taken many things from her but not her dignity. He had known her less than a week. And already, he could feel the rules beginning to blur. The fourth week at Walker Ridge Ranch brought the kind of heat that made the earth crack open and the horses restless by noon. Even before sunrise, the air felt heavier, holding on to yesterday's warmth like it refused to let go. Clara Weiss had learned by then that Texas mornings could be beautiful in a way that felt almost unfair. Soft gold light over the pasture. Windmills turning slow against a pale sky. Coffee brewing somewhere before dawn. It was too peaceful for wartime. Too normal. That was what unsettled her most. That morning, Ethan Walker rode out early to check the north grazing line, with Clara and Anna following behind on foot carrying feed bags and water cans. The horses were nervous. The heat had been wearing on them for days. Ethan could feel it in the way his mare shifted beneath him, ears twitching at every sound. By mid-morning, the sun stood high and sharp, turning every metal tool too hot to touch for long. They stopped near the far corral where Noah Briggs and Caleb Turner were moving a young horse into a smaller pen for shoeing. The horse was barely broken, all nerves and muscle, stamping against the dust with wild eyes. Ethan dismounted and tied his reins to the fence. "Keep back," he told the women. Clara stepped beside Anna, watching quietly. She had seen fear before. Animals carried it plainly. Men usually hid it. Noah moved too fast with the rope. The horse jerked sideways, snapping free of the post and swinging hard through the pen. Caleb stumbled backward, hitting the rail awkwardly and dropping hard into the dirt. The horse bolted past him, kicking up a storm of dust before clearing the open gate and disappearing into the pasture. For a second, nobody moved. Caleb sat against the fence, pale and breathless, his hand pressed against his side. Ethan was already moving toward him, but Clara reached him first. She dropped to her knees in the dust, steady and calm, her hands moving with practiced precision. "Do not move," she said firmly. Caleb looked startled, more from her command than the fall itself. Clara checked his breathing, pressed lightly against his ribs, watching his face instead of the injury. Ethan crouched beside her. "Is it bad?" Clara shook her head. "No broken bones. But he needs to sit." Slow breaths. Her voice was level. Certain. The kind of voice people listen to without thinking. Caleb obeyed. Ethan watched Clara work, watched the way her hands stayed steady, the way her eyes stayed clear, focused only on what mattered. He had seen doctors hesitate before. She did not. After a few minutes, Caleb's breathing settled. Color returned to his face. Noah let out the breath he had been holding. "How did you know?" Clara wiped dust from her hands. "Because fear makes pain louder. You have to quiet one before you can measure the other." Ethan looked at her differently after that. Not like a prisoner. Not even like a guest. Something else. Someone who had carried weight far heavier than ranch work. By noon, word had spread through Walker Ridge. The German nurse had helped Caleb. Even Henry Walker mentioned it at lunch, setting down his fork and nodding once toward Clara across the porch. Respect on a ranch was not handed out easy. But it had been handed to her now. That evening, as the sun dropped low and painted the barn red with light, Ethan found Clara at the water pump washing dust from her hands. The ranch was quiet except for the creak of leather and distant cattle moving toward shade. Ethan leaned against the wooden rail beside her. "You stayed calm today," he said. Clara kept pumping water. "Somebody had to." Ethan smiled at that. A real smile. Clara noticed but said nothing. Ethan looked at the horizon. "Where I come from, people earn trust slow." Clara dried her hands on a cloth. "Where I come from, trust is expensive." Ethan nodded like he understood, though he knew he probably did not. The silence sat between them, not empty now, but full. Heavy with things either of them knew how to name yet. On the porch, Henry watched from his rocking chair, coffee cooling in his hands. He had seen enough years to recognize a turning point when it came. Not loud. Never loud. Just quiet. Like a gate swinging open somewhere far off, changing the direction of everything. By the 5th week, Walker Ridge Ranch had developed its own rhythm, and it no longer felt like strangers were passing through it. The mornings still began before sunrise, with dew clinging to the grass and the wind moving slowly across open fields. But something had changed in the way people looked at each other. Clara Weiss noticed it first in small moments that no one talked about. A nod from Noah Briggs instead of silence. A second cup of coffee left on the fence rail without explanation. A horse held steady longer than necessary so she could pass without rushing. Ethan Walker noticed it too, though he would not have known how to explain it if asked. It was in the pauses between words. The way Clara no longer waited for instructions before stepping into work. The way she sometimes looked at the horizon as if she recognized something in the land that others missed. That morning, the heat arrived early, rising from the ground before 8 o'clock and turning the air thick and unmoving. Henry Walker decided they would move cattle to the northern pasture before noon to avoid the worst of it. Ethan, Noah, Caleb, and Clara were assigned to help with the drive. It was not unusual work anymore. Clara had become part of the routine without anyone formally saying it. The cattle moved slowly at first, uneasy in the heat, kicking up soft clouds of dust as they crossed the open stretch of land between fences. Ethan rode ahead, guiding the line, while Clara and Caleb worked the side, keeping stragglers from breaking away. The work was steady, repetitive, almost quiet except for the occasional low call and the sound of hooves against dry earth. Near the halfway point, they stopped at a shaded creek bed where the cattle could rest and drink. The water was low that year, but still enough to gather in shallow pools beneath the trees. Clara knelt beside the creek, filling canteens. Ethan sat a few feet away, loosening his gloves, watching the way the light filtered through leaves onto the water. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan broke the silence. "You ever think about where you would be if none of this had happened?" Clara did not answer immediately. She watched the water instead, as if the answer might be there. "I think about before," she said finally. "Not where I would be. Just before." Ethan nodded slowly. He understood that more than he expected. Before war. Before ranch land. Before everything that makes distance between people feel permanent. A sudden sound pulled their attention back to the herd. One of the younger cows had drifted too far from the group and was circling nervously near a low dip in the ground where the earth had softened after last week's brief rain. Caleb moved to correct it, but the ground gave slightly beneath the animal's weight. It slipped, not falling hard, but enough to panic the herd. The cattle shifted, restless and uncertain, the line beginning to break. Ethan reacted first, moving on horseback to close the gap, but Clara was already moving on foot through the dust. She did not shout. She did not rush. She walked directly into the space where the cattle were about to scatter, raising one hand slowly, not to stop them, but to steady the direction of movement. Her voice was low, controlled, almost calm enough to be mistaken for part of the wind. Something about it worked. The herd slowed. Not completely, but enough for Ethan and Noah to regain control and guide them back into formation. When it was over, the only sound left was breathing and distant birds returning to the trees. Ethan looked at Clara from his horse. "You were not supposed to be in front of them," he said. Clara brushed dust from her sleeves. "They were going to break anyway." Noah shook his head slightly. "You just walked into a stamp line like you owned it." Clara gave a small, tired look. "They were not angry. Just afraid." Ethan dismounted and walked toward her. "That is not something most people can see." Clara met his eyes then, steady and unshaken. "Most people are too loud to notice fear properly." That stayed with him longer than anything else that day. By late afternoon, the cattle were settled in the northern pasture, and the heat had reached its peak, pressing down on everything with a heavy stillness. The men rested in the shade of the barn, drinking water in silence. Clara sat a few feet away, watching the horizon. Ethan sat beside his father on the steps. Henry did not look at him, but spoke anyway. "She is not like the others," Henry said. Ethan nodded. "No." Henry sipped his coffee. "Careful with things that do not fit where they are placed." Ethan did not answer. He kept his eyes on Clara, who was still watching the distance, as if waiting for something only she could hear coming. And for the first time, Ethan realized it was not just the ranch that was changing. It was everything around it, quietly shifting into something no one had agreed to, but everyone was already part of. The 6th week began with a different kind of silence at Walker Ridge Ranch, not the silence of uncertainty but the silence that follows when something unspoken has already changed the shape of a place. The morning still arrived with pale light over the pasture and dust rising behind the cattle pens, but the conversations between the men had become shorter, more careful, as if everyone was listening for something that had not yet been said out loud. Clara Weiss noticed it before anyone explained it. It was in the way Noah Briggs avoided looking toward the bunkhouse after breakfast. It was in the way Caleb Turner suddenly started fixing things that were not broken. And it was in Ethan Walker, who had grown quieter in the moments when Clara was near, as if words had become less reliable than presence. That morning, Henry Walker sent Noah and Caleb to check the eastern boundary fence, while Ethan was assigned to oversee feed storage. Clara and Anna Keller were helping sort grain supplies near the barn, working side by side in the shade where the heat had not yet fully reached. The task was ordinary, repetitive, the kind of work that usually erased thought rather than created it. But something unusual broke the rhythm just after midday. Noah Briggs returned early from the fence line, dust on his boots, hat in his hand instead of on his head. He did not go to the barn or the house. He walked straight toward the water trough where Anna Keller was filling buckets. The ranch did not stop, but something inside it did. Even the horses seemed to slow, as if they understood the weight of attention without being told. Noah stood there for a moment without speaking. Anna noticed him but did not move away. Clara watched from a distance, sensing before understanding that something had shifted beyond routine. Noah cleared his throat once, as if preparing for a difficult task rather than a simple conversation. He said Anna's name carefully, not like a label, but like something he had been practicing. Then he reached into his pocket and placed something small on the edge of the wooden trough. It was not large, not dramatic, but it changed the air around them immediately. A simple ring made from bent wire and shaped metal, not polished, not refined, but unmistakably intentional. Anna looked at it without touching it. The barn behind them seemed suddenly too quiet. Noah spoke again, slower this time, his voice low enough that it did not carry far. "I do not know what happens after the war," he said. "I do not even know what is supposed to happen now. But I know you work harder than anyone I have ever met. And I know you are not what they said you were when you arrived here." Anna's hands stayed on the bucket. Clara, watching from a few yards away, felt the moment tighten, like a rope pulled too far without breaking. Anna finally looked up. Her expression was not shock. It was confusion shaped by years of expecting every kindness to come with a cost. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward Clara, as if trying to confirm whether this moment was real or another misunderstanding of the world she had been placed inside. Clara did not move. She simply nodded once. Not approval. Not instruction. Just acknowledgement that this was happening. Ethan Walker had appeared near the barn door without anyone noticing when he arrived. He stood still, hat in hand, watching the exchange without interfering. Caleb Turner was behind him, equally quiet, as if both men understood that stepping forward would disturb something fragile and irreversible. Anna finally spoke. Her voice was soft, almost careful. "You do not know me," she said. Noah did not argue. "I know enough," he replied. That was when the words spread without being spoken further. Not through speech, but through presence. Men who had been working in the far pasture began looking toward the barn. Henry Walker stepped out onto the porch, squinting into the distance, sensing change before understanding it. Clara felt Ethan's eyes on her, but she did not turn. She stayed focused on Anna, on Noah, on the small object resting between them like a question that could not be answered quickly. The ranch did not erupt. It did not celebrate. It simply adjusted, as if a new weight had been placed into the balance of something already fragile. And somewhere beyond the fences, beyond the cattle lines and open fields, the world that had written rules about distance and permission and belonging had not yet spoken, but it was already beginning to notice. The evening air on Walker Ridge Ranch carried a different weight now, as if even the wind had learned to move more carefully through the fences and barn beams. The sun was dropping low behind the western pasture, stretching long shadows across the ground where cattle had finally settled after a full day of heat. Work had ended earlier than usual, not because of fatigue, but because everyone seemed to feel the need to stop without being told. Ethan Walker noticed it first in himself. The way his hands hesitated before reaching for tasks that no longer needed doing. The way his eyes kept drifting, not toward the horizon, but toward Clara Weiss. She was by the water pump near the barn, washing dust from her forearms, sleeves rolled to her elbows, movements steady and unhurried. Anna Keller sat nearby on an overturned bucket, speaking quietly with Greta Hoffman in Low German, their voices mixing with the distant creak of leather and the occasional shift of horses in the stable. Henry Walker stood on the porch in silence, watching the ranch the way a man watches whether he knows he cannot control. Ethan walked slowly across the yard, not with purpose, but with certainty that had been building for days without permission. Clara noticed him before he reached her, but she did not stop what she was doing. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that he could see the faint lines of dust still clinging to her skin despite the water. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The ranch seemed to hold its breath again, like it had done earlier that week when Noah Briggs had placed that small ring on the trough. Ethan looked at Clara not like a decision, but like something already decided long before either of them had learned the words for it. "People around here are starting to talk," Ethan said quietly. Clara did not look surprised. "They were always going to talk." Ethan nodded once. "That is not why I came over." Clara finally looked at him. Direct. Calm. The same way she had looked at everything since she arrived. Ethan reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out his father's pocket watch. The silver was worn smooth from years of use, the edges softened by time and work. He held it for a moment before speaking again. "This belonged to my father," he said. "He used to tell me that time only matters when you know what you are waiting for." Clara studied the watch without touching it. Ethan continued, his voice steadied but lower than before. "I do not know what Washington is going to do with all of this. I do not know what happens when rules catch up to people who are just trying to live through them." He paused, then added, "But I know what I see when I look at you." Clara's expression did not change, but something in her posture softened slightly, like she was listening more carefully now than before. Ethan took a breath, slower this time. "I am not asking you to forget where you came from," he said. "And I am not asking you to be anything other than what you already are." He looked down briefly at the pocket watch, then back at her. "I am asking if, when this is all over, you would want to find out what life looks like when it is not defined by war." The words hung in the space between them, not heavy, but irreversible. Clara did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked past him toward the pasture, where the last light of day was turning the grass into something almost golden. Anna Keller had stopped talking. Even Henry on the porch had gone still. Clara finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear enough to carry in the evening air. "You are asking me to trust a future I cannot see yet." Ethan nodded. "Yes." Clara looked back at him, and for the first time since she arrived at Walker Ridge, her expression carried something that was not entirely guarded. Not hope. Not certainty. Something closer to recognition. "I do not trust futures," she said softly. "I trust what people do when there is no reason for them to do it." Ethan did not respond right away. Instead, he held the pocket watch a moment longer, then closed his hand around it. Clara did not take it. Not yet. But she did not step away either. Behind them, the ranch remained still, as if even the land understood that some moments did not need witnesses to become permanent. And for the first time since the war had scattered all of them into places they never expected, something fragile but real settled between silence and possibility. The morning they arrived, Walker Ridge Ranch felt different before anyone spoke a word. The air was colder than usual, not from weather but from the kind of silence that follows official presence. A black government truck stood near the main gate, its engine still running, dust settling slowly around its tires. Two men in plain military coats stepped down, carrying folders that looked heavier than they should have been. Ethan Walker saw them first from the barn. He did not call out. He simply stood still, watching. Henry Walker stepped out onto the porch a moment later, his expression tightening in a way that told Ethan he already understood what this meant. Clara Weiss was by the water pump when she noticed the change in movement across the ranch. Work had not started yet. No cattle had moved. Even the horses seemed unsettled. The men from Washington did not speak loudly when they entered the yard. They did not need to. Authority carried its own sound. One of them introduced himself as Lieutenant Carter Reynolds, Department of War Liaison. His partner remained silent, scanning the ranch, making notes without stopping. Henry Walker stepped forward first. "We were expecting inspection," he said calmly. Reynolds nodded. "This is inspection." But it was not only inspection. Ethan felt it immediately. Something beneath the surface. Not accusation. Not approval. Evaluation. Clara stood near the barn, hands still damp from water, watching without moving closer. Anna Keller stood beside her, tense but quiet. Greta Hoffman had stopped mid-task, as if the entire ranch had shifted into a different state of time. Reynolds opened his folder. "We have received reports regarding non-standard interactions between assigned labor personnel and prisoners of war." The words were precise, chosen carefully, like each one had been weighed before being spoken. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, not fear, but recognition. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for without admitting it. Henry responded evenly. "All assignments have followed labor cooperation guidelines." Reynolds did not argue. He simply turned a page. "We are aware of labor compliance," he said. "This is not about compliance." The second man finally spoke, his voice quieter but sharper. "It is about conduct beyond labor conditions." The wind moved through the yard, pushing dust across the ground in slow lines. Clara's eyes shifted slightly toward Ethan, but neither of them moved. Reynolds closed the folder for a moment, as if deciding how to continue. "There are documented instances of personal attachment forming between assigned personnel and prisoners," he said. "These instances are not authorized under current federal regulation." The word, attachment, hung in the air longer than anything else had that morning. Ethan stepped forward before Henry could respond. "These people are working the same land we are," he said. "They are not causing harm to anyone." Reynolds looked at him directly. "That is not the question." Silence followed. "Not the comfortable kind. The kind that rearranges everything it touches." Clara finally walked forward, not quickly, not hesitantly, just steadily. She stopped a few feet from the officials. "What happens now?" she asked. "If someone chooses to stay when they are allowed to leave?" The question was simple, but it changed the tone of the entire yard. Reynolds did not answer immediately. The second man glanced at him, then back at Clara. "That is not a decision made here," he said finally. "That is a decision made in Washington." Ethan felt the weight of those words settle deeper than expected. Not because they were surprising, but because they confirmed what had always been true. Distance still controlled everything. Clara nodded once, as if she had expected that answer long before asking the question. Anna stepped closer to her side. Greta remained still behind them. Henry Walker finally spoke again. "You are here to check labor compliance," he said. "So check it." Reynolds looked at the ranch once more, at the fences, the cattle, the workers moving in silence, the women standing together near the barn. Something in his expression softened, not into approval, but into recognition of complexity. "We will file our report," he said. "Until then, operations continue as assigned." The truck doors closed again a few minutes later. The engine started. Dust rose as they left the property the same way they had arrived, without resolution, only observation. When they were gone, no one spoke for a long time. The ranch returned slowly to its rhythm, but not the same one as before. Ethan stood near the barn, pocket watch still in his hand. Clara was across the yard, looking toward the road where the truck had disappeared. The distance between them felt unchanged physically, but something invisible had shifted in how that distance was understood. And for the first time, everyone on Walker Ridge Ranch understood the same unspoken truth. What had begun quietly between people was no longer contained by fences, work assignments, or silence. It had reached the edge of something larger, and that larger thing had finally noticed. The letter arrived on a late autumn morning when the wind over Walker Ridge Ranch carried the first real edge of winter. It came in a plain government envelope, no return address that meant anything personal, only official markings stamped in dark ink. Ethan Walker found it first in the mailbox near the gate. He did not open it immediately. He just stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of paper through the envelope as if it already carried the answer to something that had been building for months. Clara Weiss was in the barn when he returned. The ranch had been quiet since the last inspection weeks earlier, quieter in a different way now, like everything was waiting without knowing what it was waiting for. Henry Walker was repairing a saddle near the workbench, his movements slower than usual. Ethan did not speak until he reached Clara. When he did, his voice was calm, but different. Not uncertain. Decided. "It is from Washington," he said. Clara stopped what she was doing. She looked at him without asking to see the letter. She already understood what it meant. Ethan opened it carefully. The paper was thin, precise, filled with language that felt distant even when read aloud. It confirmed what they already suspected after the inspection. All non-standard civilian attachments involving prisoner personnel were to be terminated within 30 days of official notice. Transfers would be arranged. Assignments would be reassigned. No exceptions. The words were clear, but the meaning was heavier than ink could carry. No one interrupted. Not Henry. Not Noah Briggs standing near the barn. Not Anna Keller or Greta Hoffman, who had gathered quietly nearby as if drawn by instinct rather than instruction. Ethan lowered the letter slowly. The wind moved through the open barn doors, carrying dust across the floor in soft waves. Clara stepped forward and took the letter from his hand. She read it once. Then again. Not because she did not understand it, but because she understood it completely. When she finished, she folded it carefully and placed it back in Ethan's hand. "So this is the part where everything ends," she said quietly. Ethan did not answer immediately. The truth was too simple to argue with. Henry Walker finally spoke from behind them. "Government always arrives late to things it does not understand," he said. His voice carried no anger. Only age. Noah Briggs looked toward Anna Keller, then away. Caleb Turner stared at the ground as if the answer might be written there. Clara turned slightly toward the ranch, toward the cattle lines stretching into the distance, toward the place that had slowly become something more than work for her. "I do not think it is ending," she said. "I think it is being moved." Ethan looked at her. "That is the same thing to them." Clara nodded once. "Yes," she said. "But not to us." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything they had not said over the weeks that led to this moment. The mornings, the work, the small changes no one had named. Ethan closed the letter slowly. "You do not have much time," he said. Clara understood what he meant. Not just time on the paper. Time in reality. Time before decisions were forced by distance again. That evening, the ranch gathered near the barn without being called. No formal meeting. No announcement. Just people arriving as if the air itself had pulled them together. Henry stood near the fence. Noah and Caleb leaned against the posts. Anna and Greta stayed close to Clara. Ethan stood slightly apart, still holding the pocket watch in his hand. Clara looked at each of them for a long moment. Then she spoke. "I did not come here by choice," she said. "None of us did." She paused. "But I learned something here that I did not learn before." The wind softened for a moment, as if even it was listening. "I learned that people are not where they are placed," she continued. "They are what they choose to recognize in each other when nothing forces them to." Ethan lowered his eyes slightly, not from shame, but from understanding. Clara turned toward him. "You asked me once about a future," she said. Ethan nodded. "Yes. I cannot see it," she said. "But I know what I will not forget." She looked at the ranch, at the land, at the people standing quietly under the fading light. "This place did not change who I am," she said. "It reminded me who I was before everything was taken away from me." No one spoke after that. Not because there was nothing to say, but because anything more would have been too small. The days that followed were quiet in a different way. Work continued. Horses moved. Cattle were tended. But something inside the rhythm had shifted permanently. Clara still worked the fields. Ethan still rode the fence lines, but the distance between them no longer felt like separation. It felt like time waiting to be resolved. On the final morning before reassignment orders were expected to arrive, Clara stood near the fence line alone. The sun was rising slowly over the pasture, turning the grass gold. Ethan approached without speaking at first. He stopped beside her, pocket watch in hand. He did not open it. Clara looked at it once, then at him. "You never told me what you wanted from that question you asked," she said. Ethan shook his head slightly. "I think I already have it," he replied. Clara did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked toward the horizon, where the land disappeared into light. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but certain. "Then do not lose it," she said. Ethan nodded once. Not as agreement. As understanding. And for the first time since the war had scattered everything into pieces, the silence between them did not feel like an ending. It felt like something still becoming real.